Okay, this is a reply to Electro regarding the conveyor belt. Not quite right. So, sitting on the conveyor belt doesn't matter. We can eliminate that because it says, can the plane take off? And part of the procedure for a plane taking off is to start the engines and increase their thrust. So we can eliminate that one of your four altogether. There's two ways to measure the speed of the airplane. The lateral speed of the wheels moving forward, which is the most likely here, or the rotational speed of the wheels. Now, it says in the opposite direction the wheels are moving. So we can safely say that's lateral speed, meaning the speed the wheels are moving forward, which means the belt can never move more than 2 times the speed of the wheels of the airplane, which means the airplane will take off and the friction on the wheels will simply be double. We can eliminate all your frictionless scenarios because we assume reality here. The only fictional aspect is the conveyor belt. Now, if you look at the conveyor belt from the point of friction, there are 2 ways the conveyor belt can interact. Again, we are assuming lateral speed, like the Mythbusters tested, but let's just for the hell of it assume for a second that we're talking about rotational speed, and the 2 will approach infinity. The airplane will still take off. Because you can't have friction for one and not friction for the other. So if you have friction in the wheel belt, in the wheel bearings, then you also have friction for the conveyor belt. And have you ever heard of the Magnus effect? So when the conveyor belt begins to ramp up in speed, it's going to drag the atmosphere along with it. So long before the bearings catch fire and melt down, the conveyor belt itself will be moving a large enough volume of air for the airplane to actually take off, even if it's stationary. Because an airplane does not require ground speed to take off. An airplane requires airspeed. There are actually cases of, for example, smaller aircraft like a Cessna flying hover, just hovering in the air, because the headwind they're flying into is equal to the thrust they're putting forward, and that combined airspeed is still enough for the airplane to fly, so it just sits there hovering in place. And they've even have video of the airplanes going backwards ground speed, because the headwind is stronger than the thrust the engine's putting out, but the airspeed is still high enough to be above the stall speed. So at some point, long before the bearings wear out, the conveyor belt is going to be dragging enough air along with it. Because remember, infinitely long, okay, or runway length, whatever. That's a lot of air. The airplane's going to take off. Now, the airplane does have a problem. And that problem is, the moment the airplane leaves the conveyor belt, which it will do, the wheels are going to begin to slow down. Which means the conveyor belt is going to begin to slow down. And therefore, the air the conveyor belt is dragging along with it is going to begin to slow down. And the airplane can't leave the ground effect area above the belt, because otherwise it's going to hit that boundary where it's going to move into non-moving air, but it has no ground speed. So the moment that plane leaves the ground, that pilot has to punch it and punch it hard. Hit the afterburners if you got them. The 747 doesn't have, but you know what I mean. They're going to have to push those yokes to the floor, because it has to attain an airspeed or a ground speed that is sufficient to generate enough airspeed when it leaves that boundary layer from the conveyor belt, or when the conveyor belt finally slows down enough. So take off, don't touch the brakes, don't retract the landing gear, because you got to keep those wheels spinning as long as possible. Floor the throttles to the wall, and hope you have enough airspeed before you leave the ground effect zone around the conveyor belt. But either which way, no matter how you arrange the conditions, if we stick with reality, and the only exception to reality is this magical conveyor belt, no matter what, the plane takes off. And the trick here, the reason this question confuses people, is because even after they appear to understand that an airplane produces thrust, they still think car. They still think a person on a treadmill. And people who aren't engineers, people who don't understand rocketry. Like I tend to fly rockets. People who understand rocketry and aerospace know this, but people who don't have difficulty letting go of that concept that the wheels have to push on the ground for it to go. They have difficulty realizing that an airplane does not require wheels. If you were to lock up those wheels on ice, the airplane could still take off. If you put floats on it and put it on the water, it can still take off. If you put skis on it, you put it in grass or snow, it'll still take off. If you put a hovercraft airbag, they've done that, on the bottom of an airplane and hit the throttle, it'll still take off. Because the airplane is producing thrust independent of the ground. The airplane is what we call a mass thrower. It's throwing mass behind it, which is projecting it forward. It's not pushing on the ground to go forward. And even after people say, yep, I understand that, in the back of their brain, they're still thinking that, whether they should be or not. And that is what confuses people. And that's what makes it difficult for them to understand that the conveyor belt cannot stop the airplane from taking off.